Hey, YouTubians. Today I'm modeling my Scott Thorne t-shirt for you, but you'll only see it when I do that. Can't look at where the camera is. I'm going to do a writing advice um, video, um, but I'm going to come at it via a kind of flame on Facebook and then a map and a discussion on Twitter, and it'll all funnel down into a piece of comprehensible writing advice. So bear with me. So I'm on a Facebook group today, and I had posed a question. I'd said is subgenre A the opposite of subgenre B? Um, Literally in those that level of generic question. There was no sort of snarky wording around it. It was just and some guy came back and he was like just a flood of vitriol, and it was like genre B has all of these things going for it, and how dare you imply, and yada yada, and you're a piece of shit. And we've all had the experience when you're arguing on the internet or sometimes in real life that the person you're talking to is essentially, while your lips are moving or while you're typing, they've just gone into a holding pattern, and the words that you reply with are of no interest to them whatsoever. It's just you have your turn, and then floodgates open, and they'll give you more of the same. And so that you've all been in those sort of arguments on the internet where literally nothing you say will have any impact whatsoever on the other person. And you've probably also been in a situation where you've got a post up about something innocuous, and someone just appears from nowhere. You don't know them, and just lets you have it with both barrels, as if you had said something completely at odds with what you'd said. You may have posted about the best color for a bath, and they're on there calling you a communist and saying that you want to take their guns away from them. That sort of level of thing. And this was the situation with this guy, that he clearly was aching to have an argument with, either about these what the subgenre one of the subgenres in this is A, the opposite of B, um, or he had some sort of gripe against me. But it was the words that I had put there were just a sort of opportunity for the vitriol. And the way I'm weaving through this flame effectively, and then onto the Twitter thing, is to just um, alert would-be writers that real life is not that dissimilar from when you're writing a book or a story. That you cannot assume that the reader is paying close attention to the words that you put on the page, and there are levels of stressing and repetition that are required if you desire some piece of information to really be taken on board by them. So let's look at the other thing I was going to show you. So I just move my picture aside here. Oh, I'm on my blog here, which is you should follow. Look, I don't even know what following means in this context or what happens, but you should definitely do it, and you should bounce around a lot and that push my total up towards 5 million hits. Um, but my most recent post there is a map for the library trilogy. And it's somewhat tongue in cheek because it's just this big grid of squares. But these are the numberings. So if you're if you're reading the book, these are the numberings for the chambers in it. A map would help you locate yourself, although the pattern is described in the book, so you can easily um, sketch it out for yourself if you desire. So I posted this map, which has to be said is a step up from the map that I did for the Book of the Ice, which is just a white page. And in fact, my last three trilogies have not had maps. And so I'm going to show you the reply I got from one person, and I blanked out their name because I in no way want to suggest that the things he is saying are unusual or foolish. They are an example of the disconnect that can sometimes happen between the reader and the page. Um, and I continue to have a conversation with this guy, and I explained my interest in when these disconnects happen, and it was all fine. And but I blanked out his name just because I don't want anyone um, hunting him down and giving him any stick for any reason whatsoever. But he doesn't deserve any stick. It's not a stupid or foolish thing that he has done. It is merely an example that I wish to present of how at odds a reader's um, mental image map of a book can be with the one that's actually on the page. So I had posted this map, and this chap tweets back, and he says this has really helped. And then he asks, although was I wrong in thinking each room was circular? So we'll find out later why he developed the idea that the chambers in the library are circular. But we're now going to look at how much counter information he was prepared to ignore once he had adopted this image of them being circular. Um, and the first counter example is that I've just shown you a map, and he's still asking, was I wrong in thinking they were circular? Now, you would think that having seen this map of all these squares, what are the odds that Lawrence really put in circular rooms and just decided for the map to show people squares? But even with that there, he's still asking, was I wrong? Because he can't quite wean himself off the idea of them being circles. And again, I'm not making fun of him. I might smile, but it's a part of the human condition. It happens to all of us in different circumstances. And again, I'm naturally a bit snarky. It's in my blood. We Brits, sarcasm is a second language for us, and my default is snark. So again, there was nothing intended here, but I've said that there is frequent mention of corners, um, and of the chambers being 2 miles on a side, and of them possessing north, east, south, and west walls. And I would guess that there were over 20 mentions of each of these things in the book. And then I went and had a look and did a counting on the corners, for example, and I found that there are 10 explicit mentions of the chamber corners, but many more than 20 mentions of the west wall or the east wall. And there's an explicit line. It says, but the layout wasn't really in question, an endless grid of square chambers. So and there's sections where it talks about the corners of the library, not just in passing, but there's a whole business about how in the corners of the library organic material slowly disintegrates, and that makes them effective areas to use as toilets. So it's not just a sort of offhand mention of corners. We talk about them in, Elvira is embarrassed that she didn't know about these corner toilets, and there's a whole interaction about this stuff. So um, and then I explain I was that I'm pursuing the issue not to make him feel bad, but because um, I'm interested in how hard it is using mere words to sway someone away from an opinion that they have developed in their head. Um, and it turns out here he says that in one of the early Evar chapters there was a mention about their chamber that something about their chamber mentioned that was circular. So there's a circular pool in there, which is about 2 meters across, and then there's a circle of props around that is I don't know, some tens of yards, but it's sufficient to feed the people there. And the image just stuck, he said, and this is true, that he now had this image that the chamber was circular, and no amount of mentioning of the corners and of what goes on in the corners and of the walls and of it being torn aside and explicitly saying it's an endless grid of square chambers and then a map with squares. He's still thinking that it was circular and checking that he hadn't made a mistake. So the writing rule that this leads me into is one it's not a rule, it's just advice, but I call it the rule of three. And it's one I conceived when I was writing short stories online. And I'd noticed, that I would write things and get to the end of a short story, just a few thousand words. And at the end, someone would say, but I thought, and just a second, I'm going to sip some coffee. Someone would say, but I thought, and I would be able to say, well, look, if we go back to, page 2, it says explicitly here the opposite of what you thought. So, no, he wasn't a dragon, he was a mouse. But I also learned that that didn't matter, that you couldn't make a story good by sort of hectoringly going back and showing the reader on page 2 it says he's a dragon. If the reader thought he was a mouse for whatever reason, in some sense it's their fault, but it's not really. Your job is to write a story that doesn't allow them to think it's a mouse. Now, nothing's ever going to be 100% tight. And maybe my job was to write a story that didn't allow this chap to think that the chambers were circular, and I failed. He did, but we're talking about percentages here. So what my job is to do is to write a story where the vast majority of the readers get the picture that I am trying to give them. So whilst writing these short stories, I came up with something I called the rule of three, which was that if I wanted at least half of readers to understand something, just a small snippet of knowledge, like he was a dragon, by the end of the story, then I would need to have stated this thing clearly 3 times. It doesn't mean repetition. I mean, it could mean repetition. You could say he was a dragon, he was a dragon, he was a dragon in 3 different places. And if you did that, 50% of the people who read that story by the end would actually have on board that he was a dragon. So that's my rule of 3. And the implementation would be like, say you had it was for things that are to some degree unexpected. So say you had a character who had wings. You could say on page 1, Jim had wings. And at page 10, when characters say, "Oh, I forgot he had wings," he like at page 10 he falls out of the window of a tower, and now he's soars into distance, and readers go, "How's he soaring? What's going on here? I don't understand. I'm confused." And yes, I could go back and say, "Look, on page 1 or 2, it said Jim had wings, so how can you be confused?" Well, no, that's just the way reading works. So the rule of 3 would say, well, you can actually literally say Jim has wings 3 times, but that's not very good writing. But if you express that sentiment, so maybe on page 2, Jim had wings, but on page 4, Jim rustled his wings, flexed his shoulders, and his wings rustled. And maybe on page 7, something about shedding a feather. But 3 things that work together to repeat that idea of the unusual thing that you want the reader to have on board. And because I was having a conversation with one of my patrons the other day about their writing, and she'd asked me if a particular thing was clear through the story, and it wasn't. I having read it once and then having the question in front of me and going through and reading it again and taking notes, I found a couple of very subtle hints that this thing might be the case. And that's the thing, as writers, you tend to feel, well, if I put in a few subtle hints, the reader will pick up on those subtle hints, put them together, and reach the conclusion I want them to. This is just not true. Anything that as a writer you feel is subtle is completely invisible to most readers, because they've got the entire thing in front of them. They're faced with everything on the page, and subtlety is just not going to come through. it sort of stands out like a sore thumb to you because you, as the writer, are thinking about it. I want the reader to know that Frank likes pineapples, but unless you come out and say Frank likes pineapples, a good three times, most people aren't going to notice. If you just sort of hint at it by, his eyes strayed towards the the third aisle in the supermarket, and then a bit later on you talk about the third aisle as being lined with tins and tins of pineapples, that's not going to cut it. So if you want to get a concept across, forget subtlety, stick it in their face. And if you stick it in their face three times, they might get it. Um, which is, somewhat counterintuitive, but it tends to be the way that writing works. Um, and I think that's probably beaten the subject to death. I have told you this thing at least three times, so 50% of you are going to take it on board and just accept that writing is words are a blunt instrument, and if you want to get a concept across, generally speaking, you have to bludgeon the reader with it. And with that happy thought, I will hunt for the off button and leave you till next time.